So I'm trying a different setup here to see if the sound quality be better for me. I want to follow up on something I discussed yesterday, which is the difference between reconciliation and forgiveness. And a classic example of forgiveness that is often used is Joseph in the Old Testament, where when his brothers came and he revealed himself to them, he said, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good," which is very true. And Joseph did receive his brothers, he did forgive them. But if you look at Genesis chapter 40, you'll see that first he tested them. He tested them to see if there's a change of heart. Did they have any regret? They didn't recognize him, but he recognized them. And so, of course, he had risen up, after all those trials of being put in prison, of being a servant, of being a slave, and he risen up to being the number two man in Egypt, that God raised him up to that level. But when his brothers sold him into slavery, he was like a young teen, maybe 12, maybe he's 12, 13 years old. But now he's a grown man, so they don't recognize him. And of course, he's looking like an Egyptian and all that, but he recognized them. And he still understood their language, but they didn't understand the language he was speaking, perhaps. So what he did was he hid behind his servants in the palace. He had guards, armed guards. There's no reason for him to be afraid because he was protected. But he tested them. He gave them a task to go and bring their youngest brother and leave him there. And then he listened to their conversation. And as they expressed their regret among themselves about the terrible thing they did to Joseph, Joseph saw that they had a change of heart. That's when he was then, that because that testing and to check on if there's a change of heart, there's not only forgiveness, but reconciliation that could occur. Joseph had forgiveness for them. He was a godly man. He lived for God. Even though there's nobody else in Egypt around him that believed the same as him, he kept his faith in God through all those years and all those trials. And he had forgiveness in his heart, but he tested them to make sure that there was a change on their part before the reconciliation happened. Reconciliation, an important part of that is that the person who offends, the person who hurts us, needs to show that they understand what the harm they did. There needs to be regret on their part. There needs to be a desire to make things right. If that's not there, we still need to have forgiveness in our heart, which is hard to do. It's not always easy to do that. It's not always easy to forgive. But if we do that, if we have that forgiveness, and sometimes we just have to keep going to God for Him to help us with that, keep going to the cross, keep seeking Jesus. Sometimes just saying, Jesus, please forgive them through me, because it's a big wound. Letting Jesus heal us and bring healing to our heart, to our souls. Then if that happens where there is a change on that person's part, perhaps that reconciliation can occur. I've also heard stories, wonderful stories of people expressing forgiveness to somebody who's harmed them, but there wasn't a prior relationship. Examples of somebody going to visit the person in prison who, through a car accident, killed their family. Um, so there wasn't a prior relationship among between them, but the person came to a point of forgiving and actually wanting to use that to see that person be able to come to Christ. That's a deep, deep forgiveness. I once heard a story about Corrie ten Boom, who was imprisoned by the Nazis in a prison camp. Her sister died in the prison camp. She saw her sister die. She lived in that lice-infested, terrible conditions. And she was in a church in Germany after the war. And she saw a guard come in, a man who was one of the guards in the camp. And she walked up to him, put her hands on his shoulders and said, "I forgive you." Powerful story of forgiveness. Does that mean they were reconciling their best buds? No, we don't know. But we do know is that that forgiveness from her to him, that made it so he felt okay to be in the church. So there are different scenarios that can come into play. But if there's a prior relationship, and through that prior relationship that somebody's been harmed, I think of my father, I think of my mother, you know, um, there's a prior relationship there. Well, my video that I shared yesterday, I talked about how my father had regret, and I could see it. Now he wasn't perfect in it. It was he was just a broken down man by the time we had that experience. But I could see the regret. I could see he wished he had done better. He didn't know how to communicate it and all that. But because of that, we were able to have reconciliation. And after I expressed forgiveness, he came to Christ and he wanted to hear from the Bible from me and pray with me and things like that. So there was some reconciliation that occurred. So I just want to do a little follow-up video about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And when you hear that story about Joseph saying to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, remember to go back and read Genesis 40 and chapters 40 and 41 to put that whole thing into context.